The rain fell softly on the Pennsylvania countryside that November evening in 1912, tapping against the windows of the largest private residence ever constructed in the United States. Inside Lynnewood Hall, a woman sat alone in a gallery filled with Rembrandts and Van Dycks and Raphaels, surrounded by more artistic wealth than most museums could claim, and she was utterly, irreparably broken. Eleanor Elkins Widener had lost her son 7 months earlier, not to illness, not to accident in the conventional sense, but to the cold North Atlantic when the Titanic went down. George Dunton Widener, 27 years old, heir to a streetcar fortune worth $300 million in today's dollars, had drowned alongside his father while she and her daughter-in-law floated away in a lifeboat, survivors by the cruel mathematics of gender and chance. The mansion, 110 rooms sprawling across 70,000 square feet, stuffed with art that would eventually anchor the National Gallery of Art, had been built to announce the Widener family's arrival at the summit of American power. Now it felt like a mausoleum. The paintings looked down from their gilded frames with painted eyes that saw nothing, understood nothing, offered nothing. And Eleanor Elkins Widener understood, perhaps for the first time in her life of staggering privilege, that all the money in the world cannot buy back a single drowned son. But before we reach that moment of absolute desolation, before the lifeboats and the screaming and the terrible silence that followed, we must understand what the Wideners built. Because Lynnewood Hall was not just a house. It was a statement rendered in limestone and marble and bronze, a declaration that new money could rival old aristocracy, that American ambition could match European cultivation. It was, in every sense, a monument to the belief that wealth could purchase not just comfort or luxury, but immortality itself. The irony, of course, is that the family who built it would be destroyed by their own success, consumed by the very social climbing that made Lynnewood Hall necessary in the first place. This is not a story about a mansion. It is a story about what we sacrifice when we chase status, about the price we pay for a seat at tables that perhaps were never worth reaching in the first place. The fortune began with streetcars, not glamorous, not romantic, but staggeringly profitable. Peter Arell Brown Widener started as a butcher's apprentice in Philadelphia, a young man with sharp eyes and sharper instincts who recognized opportunities others missed. During the Civil War, he secured contracts to supply mutton to Union troops, amassing his first significant capital through the unglamorous but lucrative business of feeding armies. He parlayed that stake into urban transit, buying up horse-car lines in Philadelphia when they were still considered risky investments. Then came the revolution, electrification. Widener understood before most that electric streetcars would transform American cities, and he positioned himself to control the infrastructure. By 1890, he owned the largest urban transit network in America, a spiderweb of trolley lines that carried millions of passengers annually, each fare trickling profit into Widener coffers. The wealth accumulated with terrifying speed. Peter Widener's annual income by 1900 exceeded $5 million, roughly $170 million today, and that represented only the visible portion. His holdings included banks, utilities, real estate across multiple states, shares in industrial trusts that controlled entire sectors. He was not just wealthy. He was part of the machinery that determined how American cities functioned, how working people moved from home to factory, how capital flowed through urban arteries. This was wealth that operated at a structural level, embedded so deeply in daily life that it became invisible, natural, inevitable. But Peter Widener had a problem. He was rich, spectacularly so, but he was not accepted. Philadelphia society in the 1890s was dominated by old families who traced their lineage to colonial times, families with names like Biddle and Cadwallader who considered new money vulgar regardless of its magnitude. They collected art. They knew which fork to use. They spoke French and spent summers in Newport, and moved through society with the effortless grace of people born knowing the rules. The Wideners, for all their millions, were outsiders, tradesmen who had gotten lucky, butchers playing at aristocracy. This is where the psychology becomes fascinating. Peter Widener could have ignored Philadelphia society, could have lived comfortably with his fortune and his family and let the snobs have their dinner parties. Instead, he decided to beat them at their own game. If acceptance required cultivation, he would become cultivated. If it required art, he would acquire art. If it required architectural grandeur beyond anything Philadelphia had seen, he would build that grandeur. The decision was rational in a sense social position, translated to business advantages, to political influence, to opportunities for his children. But it was also driven by something less rational, by the wounded pride of a man who had been dismissed as inferior despite building an empire. So in 1897, Peter Widener purchased 250 acres of rolling countryside in Elkins Park, just outside Philadelphia. He hired Horace Trumbauer, the most fashionable architect of the Gilded Age, a man who specialized in designing palaces for people who needed to prove they belonged. Trumbauer's brief was simple: build the largest, most magnificent private residence in America, spare no expense. Make it impossible to ignore. The construction of Lynnewood Hall took 4 years and cost the modern equivalent of $60 million. The house was designed in the Georgian style, a deliberately conservative choice meant to evoke English country estates and signal taste rather than flash. 110 rooms, 70,000 square feet, a ballroom that could accommodate 400 guests, a dining room paneled in centuries, old oak imported from English manor houses being demolished for scrap, a gallery designed specifically to display Peter Widener's rapidly growing art collection. He was buying Rembrandts, Van Dycks, Raphaels, Vermeers, paintings that European aristocrats were selling to pay debts, paintings that would eventually form the core collection of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. If depth like this resonates with you, if you value stories that go beyond surfaces into structure and meaning, that recognition is the foundation of what makes this work possible. The hours of research, the archive, digging, the pattern, finding, it continues because people choose to support it. The scale was staggering. The entrance hall was modeled after the Palace of Versailles. The plasterwork was done by Italian craftsmen brought to Pennsylvania specifically for this project. The bronze doors at the main entrance weighed 3 tons each and required a custom mechanism just to open. The mechanical systems, heating, plumbing, electrical, were the most advanced available, designed by engineers who had worked on ocean liners. Lynnewood Hall had its own power plant, its own water system, its own ice-making facility. It was a self-contained world, a city, state of wealth planted in the Pennsylvania countryside. But a house, no matter how magnificent, is just architecture until it is filled with life, and that life required servants. Many, many servants. The household staff at Lynnewood Hall numbered 60 during the family's residence, and that counted only the live-in employees. Additional workers, groundskeepers, specialist craftsmen, temporary staff brought in for events, could push the number above 80. This was an army dedicated to maintaining the illusion of effortless grandeur, to ensuring that when Peter Widener woke in the morning, his clothes were laid out, his breakfast was prepared exactly to specification, his newspapers were ironed flat, his bath was drawn to precisely the right temperature. The operating costs of Lynnewood Hall exceeded $200,000 annually, roughly $6.5 million today. just to keep the doors open. That did not include the cost of hosting events, of maintaining the art collection, of the constant renovations and improvements that such a house demanded. This was wealth being incinerated for the sake of appearance, liquidity being converted into spectacle and social position. And from a purely financial standpoint, it made no sense. The house generated no income. It was not an investment. It was a statement, an argument rendered in marble and bronze, and the argument was simple. The Wideners belong. Did they belong? That depends on how you measure. Philadelphia society remained skeptical. The old families came to Lynnewood Hall when invited. It was impossible to refuse, given Peter Widener's business influence and political connections, but they came with reservation, with a subtle condescension that money alone could not overcome. They admired the paintings. They complimented the architecture. But they did not truly accept the Wideners as equals. That required something more than wealth. It required breeding, lineage, the ineffable quality that separated those born to privilege from those who merely acquired it. Peter Widener understood this, and so he placed his hopes in the next generation. His son Joseph and daughter-in-law Eleanor Elkins Widener could be educated, polished, trained to move through high society without the rough edges that marked Peter's own ascent. And their children, George Dunton Widener and his sister Eleanor, they would be born into wealth, raised with every advantage, educated at the finest schools, introduced to European culture, shaped from birth to be the aristocrats Peter himself could never quite become. The strategy was coldly rational. Generational wealth was not just about passing money down. It was about transforming that money into something more durable, more prestigious, more capable of weathering the social barriers that raw capital could not breach. George Dunton Widener grew up in Lynnewood Hall. He knew nothing else, had no memory of struggle or deprivation, moved through the mansion's 110 rooms with the unconscious ease of someone for whom such surroundings were simply normal. He was educated at Harvard. He traveled extensively through Europe, developing a connoisseur's appreciation for art and architecture. He learned to ride, to fence, to navigate the complex social rituals that defined upper-class life. By his mid-20s, George appeared to be exactly what his grandfather had hoped. A gentleman, polished and cultivated, indistinguishable from the sons of old money families. But there was a hollowness to it. George had no passion, no driving ambition beyond maintaining his position. Why would he? Everything had been provided. He collected books because that was what cultivated men did, amassing a library of rare first editions that would later be donated to Harvard. He attended the opera, supported charities, served on the boards of cultural institutions. He was, by all accounts, pleasant and well, liked but fundamentally aimless, a man shaped entirely by expectation with no inner fire of his own. This is the unspoken cost of extreme privilege. It can remove the need for purpose, leaving only the endless maintenance of status. In 1911, George married Eleanor Elkins, a match that delighted both families. Eleanor came from Philadelphia wealth herself. Her father, William Elkins, had partnered with Peter Widener in the streetcar business, so the marriage represented a consolidation of fortunes and social position. They honeymooned in Europe, as wealthy newlyweds did, and in early 1912 they extended that honeymoon into a grand tour. George wanted to expand his book collection, purchasing rare volumes in London and Paris. His parents, Joseph and Eleanor Widener, joined them for part of the trip. It was meant to be a celebration, a victory lap through the cultural capitals of Europe, the kind of leisurely, expensive wandering that only people entirely free from financial concerns could indulge. By April 1912, they were ready to return home. Joseph Widener, George's father, had business matters requiring his attention in Philadelphia. family booked passage on the newest, most luxurious ship in the world, the Titanic, first class, naturally. The cost of their tickets, $3,000 for the party, equivalent to $95,000 today, represented pocket change for people of their means. They were not traveling for transportation. They were traveling for the experience, for the social opportunities of crossing the Atlantic in the company of other wealthy families, for the pleasure of being part of a maiden voyage that everyone agreed would be historic. The Titanic's passenger manifest for first class read like a directory of wealth and power. John Jacob Astor Roman IV, whom we have already discussed, was aboard with his pregnant 18-year-old bride. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate, traveled with his mistress. Isidore and Ida Strauss, owners of Macy's department store, occupied a suite. Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, brought her flamboyance and her mining fortune. The Widener family, Joseph, Eleanor, George, and George's wife, Eleanor, fit perfectly into this gilded crowd. They dined together in the first-class dining saloon, attended church services in the ship's grand staircase, played cards in the smoking room, strolled the promenade deck. The ship was magnificent, a floating palace that seemed to prove the inevitability of progress, the triumph of technology and wealth over the old limitations of nature. On the evening of April 14th, the Wideners hosted a dinner party in the ship's a la carte restaurant. It was a small affair by their standards, only a dozen guests, but carefully chosen and exquisitely executed. Captain Edward Smith himself attended, taking a rare break from his duties to dine with the most prominent passengers. The meal lasted hours, course after course of French cuisine, prepared by chefs who had been hired away from Paris restaurants specifically for this voyage. Champagne flowed, conversation sparkled, the women wore gowns worth thousands, jewels borrowed from bank vaults for the crossing. The men discussed business and politics in the comfortable way of people who assumed they would always be in control. It was, by all accounts, a perfect evening, a pinnacle moment of Gilded Age excess, the kind of scene that would be endlessly recreated in films and novels, frozen in amber as the epitome of a doomed civilization. The dinner ended around 10 o'clock. Captain Smith excused himself and returned to the bridge. The guests dispersed, some to the smoking room, others to their cabins. George Widener went to the first-class lounge with his father, settling into leather chairs with brandy and cigars. The ship moved through the darkness at 22 knots, maintaining speed despite warnings of ice in the area. The North Atlantic was dead calm, unusual for April, a black mirror reflecting stars, beautiful, treacherous. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet, the lookout in the crow's nest, saw something ahead, dark, massive. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch ordered hard to starboard and full astern, desperate maneuvers that would prove insufficient. The Titanic, 11 stories tall and 880, 2 feet long, 6,000 tons of steel and ambition, could not turn quickly enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side below the waterline, opening the hull like a can opener, breaching 6 of the supposedly watertight compartments. The ship could survive 4 compartments flooding, not 6. The mathematics were absolute. The Titanic was going to sink. Before we continue, ask yourself this: what would you pay to change that moment? If the Wideners, with all their millions, could have purchased safety, purchased a different course, purchased a world where icebergs simply did not exist, what price would have been too high? This is not rhetorical. It goes to the heart of what we believe wealth means, what it can do, what it cannot. The question haunts every moment that follows. The collision was subtle. Most passengers felt only a slight shudder, heard a grinding noise that lasted seconds. George and Joseph Widener looked up from their brandy, mildly curious but not alarmed. Crew members moved through the public rooms, their expressions controlled, but within minutes the truth was spreading among those who knew ships, who understood what that particular kind of damage meant. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's builder, made a rapid inspection and gave Captain Smith the verdict. The ship had perhaps 2 hours, maybe less. The order went out. All passengers to the boat deck, life jackets on. Women and children to the lifeboats first. The instructions were delivered calmly, efficiently, with the British Reserve that prized composure above all else. But beneath that composure, chaos was building because there were not enough lifeboats, not nearly enough. The Titanic carried boats for 1,200 people. There were over 200 passengers and crew aboard. The mathematics were brutal and simple. At least 1,000 people were going to die, and the only question was which 1,000. Lynnewood Widener, George's mother, woke her daughter-in-law Lynnewood when crew members knocked on their cabin door. The 2 women dressed quickly, putting on layers against the cold, gathering their jewelry and documents. They made their way to the boat deck where the Widener men were already waiting. Lifeboat 4 was being prepared on the port side. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was in charge, enforcing the women and children first policy with rigid discipline. He allowed Lynnewood Widener and her daughter-in-law into the boat. He refused George and Joseph. The 2 men stepped back without protest. This was the code they had been raised to honor. Gentlemen do not take places from women and children. Gentlemen do not show panic. Gentlemen face death with composure. Joseph Widener put his hand on his son's shoulder. They watched the lifeboat being lowered, watched Lynnewood and Lynnewood disappearing into the darkness, 70 feet down to the black water. The boat pulled away, and the 2 men stood on the deck of a sinking ship, surrounded by hundreds of other people facing the same fate, and they waited. Did they speak? Did they make plans, discuss swimming for it, debate whether to try for another boat? The historical record offers no answers. What we know is this: neither Joseph nor George Widener survived. Their bodies were never recovered, never identified among the corpses pulled from the ocean in the days following the disaster. They simply disappeared, claimed by water so cold that death came within minutes even for strong swimmers. The streetcar fortune, the Lynnewood Hall, the art collection, the carefully cultivated social position, none of it mattered. They drowned like steerage passengers, like stokers from the engine room, like stewards who had stayed at their posts. The ocean made no distinctions. The survivors in Lifeboat 4 drifted for hours before being picked up by the Carpathia. Lynnewood Widener and her daughter-in-law spent that time in a state of shock, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by other women who had also left their men behind. They could see the Titanic in the distance, blazing with light, her stern rising higher as the bow disappeared beneath the surface. At 2:20 a.m. the lights went out, the ship broke in half, and then silence, a terrible, absolute silence broken only by the screaming of hundreds of people freezing to death in the water. The lifeboats, less than half full, did not row back to help. The people in them, including the 2 Lynnewood Wideners, sat in the darkness and listened to those screams until, gradually, they faded. And then there was only the sound of water lapping against the boats and the distant creaking of ice. If what you've heard so far has shifted something in you, if the weight of this is landing differently than you expected, that response is worth marking. These stories cost time to tell properly, and that investment becomes possible when people signal it matters to them. Not through empty gestures, but through acknowledgement that this kind of depth has value. When the news reached Philadelphia, it shattered the entire social structure of the city. The Wideners were not just wealthy. They were institutions embedded in the city's financial and cultural fabric. Joseph Widener had been a major philanthropic donor, a board member of dozens of organizations, a man whose decisions moved markets. George had been the next generation, the hope that the family's position would continue and strengthen. And now they were simply gone, erased in a single night by a piece of ice and insufficient lifeboats. The obituaries filled newspapers for weeks. Memorial services drew thousands. Business leaders eulogized Joseph as a titan of industry. Society columnists mourned George as a tragedy of interrupted promise. But Lynnewood Hall itself became something else. Eleanor Elkins Widener returned to the mansion as a widow, her son dead, her daughter-in-law also widowed at 21. The house that had been built to celebrate the family's triumph now stood as a monument to their destruction. Those 110 rooms, those 70,000 square feet of grandeur, they felt like a tomb. Eleanor moved through the art gallery, past paintings worth millions, and every canvas seemed to mock her. What good was a Rembrandt when your son was drowned? What comfort did a Vermeer offer when your husband was at the bottom of the Atlantic? The wealth that had purchased all this beauty could not purchase the one thing that mattered. It could not bring them back. Eleanor did what grieving people do when grief is unbearable, and action is the only alternative to collapse. She created a memorial. She donated $3.5 million, over $110 million today, to Harvard University to build a library in her son's name. The Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library opened in 1915, the largest university library in the world at that time, containing over 3 million volumes. George's rare book collection formed the core of the institution. His name was carved in stone above the entrance. The building was magnificent, far more enduring than any flesh. Eleanor had converted her grief into architecture, had purchased a kind of immortality for her dead son through the transformation of capital into cultural infrastructure. But there was a condition written into the donation agreement. Harvard University would never alter the core structure of the library. George's collection would remain intact, preserved exactly as he had left it. His room within the library would be maintained as a shrine, untouched, a frozen moment from 1912. Eleanor was trying to stop time, to prevent the inevitable erosion that comes to all things. She was trying to make George permanent. It did not work, not really. The library still stands, yes, students still study there, researchers still use the collections. But George himself is forgotten, except by historians and Titanic enthusiasts. His name is on the building, but almost no one who enters knows who he was, what he loved, why he died. The memorial preserved the shell but lost the soul. This is what always happens. Monuments endure longer than memory. Stone outlasts significance. Back at Lynnewood Hall, the practical consequences of the disaster unfolded over months and years. Peter Widener, George's grandfather and the original architect of the family fortune, died in 1915, only 3 years after losing his son and grandson. His death triggered a complex inheritance situation. The fortune had to be divided among surviving heirs. Estate taxes, a relatively new concept at the time, took a significant portion. The streetcar business itself was beginning to decline as automobiles offered competition and cities started regulating transit monopolies more aggressively. The operating costs of Lynnewood Hall, still exceeding $200,000 annually, became increasingly difficult to justify. The art collection began to disperse. Some pieces went to museums as donations. Tax had vantaged ways of converting illiquid assets while maintaining the family's philanthropic reputation. Other works were sold privately to collectors and institutions. The Great Gallery at Lynnewood Hall once so densely packed with masterpieces that it rivaled European museums, gradually emptied. By the 1940s, most of the significant works were gone. They ended up in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, a collection that forms one of the most important repositories of European old masters in America. The paintings survived, they found institutional homes. But they were scattered, separated from the context that had given them meaning, from the grand narrative of Widener, ambition, and cultivation that had brought them to Pennsylvania in the first place. Eleanor Elkins Widener continued to live at Lynnewood Hall until her death in 1937. She was 74 years old, a survivor of the Titanic, a woman who had lost her husband and son and outlived most of her generation. By the end, she was maintaining Lynnewood Hall with a skeleton staff, the house slowly deteriorating around her. The roof leaked, the mechanical systems failed, the gardens went wild. It was too expensive to maintain properly, too large for a single elderly woman, too haunted by memory to sell or abandon. She died there in the house her husband's family had built to announce their arrival, and with her death, the last connection to Lynnewood Hall's original purpose was severed. The subsequent history of the house is a slow-motion tragedy. Eleanor's heirs did not want it. It was unsellable, too expensive to maintain, obsolete in an age that had moved beyond Gilded Age grandiosity. The house stood vacant for decades, quietly rotting in its park-like setting. Attempts were made to convert it to institutional use, a school, a museum, a corporate retreat, but the costs were prohibitive. The real estate market had no model for selling a 110-room mansion with no practical modern purpose. It was too large to be a residence, too expensive to be a business, too historically significant to tear down, but too damaged to preserve. If you're still listening to this, still following the thread of how wealth unravels, you're engaging with something that most cultural narratives deliberately obscure. The long aftermath, the slow dissolution, the generations of consequences, staying with that complexity is a choice, and it's the choice that makes continuing this work meaningful. For decades, Lynnewood Hall existed in a strange limbo, technically owned, legally protected from demolition by historical preservation laws, but functionally abandoned. Urban explorers broke in, photographing the decay. The ballroom where 400 guests once danced was littered with fallen plaster. The grand staircase, modeled on European palaces, was warped and cracked. The conservatory glass was shattered. Water damage had destroyed much of the ornamental plasterwork. The house that had cost $60 million to build was falling apart, and no one had the resources or the will to stop it. In 2020, a developer finally purchased Lynnewood Hall with plans to restore it and convert it into some kind of event venue or luxury residential property. The details remain unclear. The costs will be astronomical. Estimates suggest it would take $100 million or more to restore the house to anything approaching its original condition. Whether that makes economic sense depends on finding a use case that can generate sufficient revenue to justify the investment. The mansion's future remains uncertain. It might be saved. It might continue to decay. It might be demolished despite historical protections, the way so many Gilded Age houses were demolished when maintaining them became impossible. This is what happens to monuments when the fortunes that sustained them disappear, because Lynnewood Hall was never self-sustaining. It was a wealth consumption engine designed to convert money into status, to incinerate liquidity in exchange for social position. As long as the Widener fortune remained intact, and the family remained committed to maintaining their position, The house made sense within its own logic. But once those conditions changed, once the deaths and the estate taxes and the business decline and the shifting social values made the equation unsustainable, the house became a liability. A beautiful, historically significant, architecturally important liability, but a liability nonetheless. The broader pattern here is crucial. The Gilded Age produced hundreds of houses like Lynnewood Hall, monuments to extreme wealth that seemed permanent and inevitable when they were built. The Vanderbilt mansions in New York and Newport, the Frick House, the Carnegie Mansion, the Whitney Estate, the Morgan Library, some survived by converting to institutional use museums, libraries, historical sites maintained by nonprofit organizations. Others were demolished, replaced by apartment buildings or office towers, or simply by landscaped parks. A few, like Lynnewood Hall, exist in suspended animation, too important to destroy but too expensive to save, waiting for someone wealthy enough and passionate enough to resurrect them. But the people are gone. The Wideners as a social force, as a family that shaped Philadelphia's cultural and economic life, essentially ended with Eleanor's death in 1937. There are descendants, of course, but they do not carry the name with the same weight, do not occupy the same position. The fortune was divided and diluted through multiple generations, subject to inheritance taxes and financial mismanagement and the simple mathematics of geometric progression. Each generation doubled the number of heirs having each share. By the third or fourth generation, Widener descendants were merely comfortable rather than dynastic, and by the fifth generation, many of them were indistinguishable from ordinary professional class families. This is the pattern of generational wealth in America. It rarely survives more than 3 generations intact. The first generation builds the fortune through ruthless ambition and often questionable methods. The second generation consolidates, using wealth to purchase social position and cultural capital. The third generation consumes, maintaining lifestyle but generating little new wealth. And by the fourth generation, the money is gone, dispersed through inheritance and taxation and simple expenditure. There are exceptions, families like the Rockefellers who institutionalize their wealth through foundations and trusts, creating mechanisms for preservation that transcend individual members. But the Wideners were not Rockefellers. They built a fortune, they built a mansion, and both dissolved within a century. The human cost of all this, the 60 servants who maintained Lynnewood Hall at its peak, where did they go? The historical record is largely silent. Most of them do not appear in archives beyond payroll ledgers and census records. We know their names sometimes. We know their wages: $12 a month for a scullery maid, $20 for a footman, $40 for a butler. We know they worked long hours, that they lived in the attic or the basement, that they were forbidden to use the main stairs or speak to family members unless spoken to. We know they were essential to maintaining the illusion of effortless grandeur that Lynnewood Hall represented. But we do not know their stories. Did they mourn when Joseph and George Widener died? Were they relieved when the household staff was reduced and some of them were let go? Did they understand themselves as exploited? Or did they accept the social hierarchy as natural and inevitable? The archive does not answer these questions. The voices of servants are almost entirely absent from the historical record, not because they did not have perspectives and opinions and inner lives, but because no one with power to preserve history thought their perspectives mattered enough to record. This erasure is not accidental, it is structural. The entire social architecture of the Gilded Age depended on rendering labor invisible, on creating the illusion that wealth simply manifested as beautiful objects and grand houses without the messy reality of human effort. When we tour surviving Gilded Age mansions today, when we walk through the ballrooms and the libraries and the art galleries, we are seeing only the public face, the carefully curated presentation. We are not seeing the kitchens where servants worked in 100-degree heat, the attic rooms where they slept four to a space, the back stairs they used to remain invisible while moving through the house. Those spaces exist, but they are not highlighted on tours. They are not photographed for coffee table books. They are erased again, perpetuating the same invisibility that defined them originally. The Widener family employed approximately 60 live-in servants at Lynnewood Hall's peak. If each of them worked for an average of 10 years, a conservative estimate, that represents 600 person-years of labor dedicated to maintaining one family's lifestyle. 600 years of human life, converted into polished floors and pressed linens and perfectly manicured gardens. What did those people give up? What were the costs to their own families, to their health, to their potential? These questions have no answers because the archive does not care about servants. It cares about the wealthy. It preserves what the powerful think matters, but consider this. One of those servants at Lynnewood Hall might have had the talent to become an artist, a writer, a scientist. Instead, they spent their life polishing silver and scrubbing floors because they were born into poverty and had no other choices. The potential they represented was consumed, converted into the smooth functioning of a household that ultimately collapsed anyway. This is not melodrama. This is the simple mathematics of opportunity cost. Every hour a servant spent maintaining Lynnewood Hall was an hour they could not spend developing their own talents, pursuing their own dreams, building their own lives. The invisible architecture beneath the visible grandeur was constructed from stolen potential. Now ask yourself, how many servants does it take to maintain your life? The question sounds absurd in a modern context. Most of us do not employ live-in servants, but we employ their equivalents. The people who clean office buildings at night, the warehouse workers who pack and ship our online orders, the delivery drivers who bring food to our doors, the agricultural laborers who harvest the food we eat, the garment workers in distant countries who sew the clothes we wear. They are invisible too, not because they do not exist, but because the economic system renders them invisible, makes their labor seem automatic, natural, disconnected from the comfort we enjoy. The pattern persists, the names change, the mechanisms evolve. But the fundamental structure, a small number of people living in comfort sustained by the invisible labor of a large number of people with no alternative, that structure endures. And so, the questions that Lynnewood Hall raises are not merely historical. They are contemporary. They are urgent. Because we are still building monuments to wealth that consume human potential, still creating systems where some people polish silver while others walk on marble floors, still pretending that grandeur appears through magic rather than through exploitation. If this recognition creates discomfort, if it challenges the narratives you've been told about success and merit and the justice of market outcomes, that discomfort is the point. These stories exist not to make you feel good, but to make you see clearly, and seeing clearly requires support not as charity, but as collaboration in the work of honest historical reckoning. The Titanic disaster that killed Joseph and George Widener also killed the illusion that wealth could purchase safety from fate. The ship was supposed to be unsinkable. That was the promise. The engineering, the expense, the sheer technological sophistication, all of it was supposed to guarantee that people in first class would arrive safely in New York, insulated from danger by the walls of privilege, and then the iceberg tore the hull open, and the privilege disintegrated. The first-class passengers died alongside third-class passengers, alongside crew members, alongside stokers from the engine room. Wealth determined who got into lifeboats first, yes, but it did not determine who lived. Many wealthy men died because they followed the code women and children first and stood on the deck while the ship went down. Their money could not save them. Their status could not save them. They drowned. This was a shock to the Gilded Age psyche. The entire structure of that society was built on the assumption that wealth could insulate its possessors from the chaos and danger that afflicted ordinary people. The mansions were fortresses, the servants were buffers, the investments and the trusts and the real estate holdings were supposed to create dynasties that would last generations. And then one ship hit one iceberg and 1,500 people died, and among them were some of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America. The lesson was unmistakable for those willing to see it. Wealth is not armor. Status is not protection. We are all fragile, all mortal, all subject to accidents and ice and the cold indifference of the ocean. But the lesson was not learned, not really, because within a generation, a new group of wealthy families had risen to replace the ones destroyed by the Titanic and the First World War and the various other catastrophes of the early 20th century, and they built their own monuments, their own systems of privilege, their own mechanisms for insulating themselves from consequences. The names changed. The Wideners gave way to the Kennedys and the Rockefellers and the DuPonts, but the pattern remained. Extreme wealth seeking permanence through architecture, through art, through the construction of dynasties that would defy time and chance. Lynnewood Hall stands today as a reminder that those efforts always fail. Always, the house is crumbling. The fortune is dispersed. The family is scattered. The servants are forgotten. The only thing that remains is the story, and the story is a tragedy. Not because the Wideners were evil, they were not, by the standards of their class and time, but because they poured their lives and their wealth into a project that was doomed from the start, the project of making wealth permanent in a world where nothing is permanent. Eleanor Elkins Widener spent the last 25 years of her life in Lynnewood Hall, a ghost in a haunted house, maintaining a lifestyle that no longer made sense because the alternative, admitting that the dream was dead, was unbearable. She had lost her husband and her son to the Titanic. She had donated millions to build a library that would preserve her son's name. She had maintained the mansion, the art collection, the social position. And in the end, she died alone in a house too large for one person, surrounded by paintings and furniture and architectural grandeur that meant nothing without the people she loved. That is the real tragedy of Lynnewood Hall, not the shipwreck, though that was tragic, not the financial decline, though that was inevitable, but the human cost of ambition, the way pursuing status and permanence consumed actual lives, actual relationships, actual possibility. Peter Widener built Lynnewood Hall to prove the Wideners belonged. Joseph and George Widener died trying to maintain that position. Eleanor survived them both and spent decades in a house that had become a prison, a monument to everything she had lost. Was it worth it? If you could ask Eleanor that question in the last years of her life, what would she say? Would she defend the choices her family made, argue that social position and cultural contribution justified the cost? Or would she trade it all, the mansion, the art, the library, the name carved in stone, for one more day with George, one more dinner party where her husband laughed and her son poured wine, and the future seemed endless? The answer seems obvious from our historical distance, but it was not obvious to the Wideners when they were living it. They were trapped in a system that made certain choices seem necessary, inevitable, natural. They were competing in a social arena where failure to build a mansion like Lynnewood Hall would have meant irrelevance, where choosing not to travel first class on the Titanic would have been unthinkable, where the entire structure of meaning and purpose was tied to maintaining position. They were not free to simply opt out. None of us are. We are all embedded in systems that shape our choices, that make certain paths seem inevitable even when they lead to catastrophe. This is why the story of Lynnewood Hall matters beyond the historical details, beyond the architectural descriptions and the financial figures and the names and dates. It matters because it reveals the trap that wealth creates, the way pursuing permanence through material grandeur consumes actual lives and generates actual suffering while ultimately failing to achieve its goal. The mansion crumbles, the fortune disperses, the name fades, and all that remains is the question, what was it for? What did all that expense and effort and human cost actually accomplish? The paintings survive, that is something. The Rembrandts and Vermeers that Peter Widener collected are now in the National Gallery, available to millions of visitors, preserved and studied and appreciated. The library Lynnewood funded at Harvard still serves scholars, still houses George's book collection, still bears his name even if few remember who he was. These are real accomplishments, real contributions to cultural preservation and public access. But they came at enormous cost: the 60 servants who maintained Lynnewood Hall, the family members who died pursuing social position, the human potential converted into polished marble and perfect gardens. Could there have been another way? Could the Wideners have used their streetcar fortune differently, invested in public education or health care or housing for the poor rather than building a 110-room mansion? The question is anachronistic. That kind of systemic philanthropy was not part of the Gilded Age vocabulary. But it is still worth asking, because the same choices face every generation of wealthy people. How do you use resources? What do you build? Who benefits? What costs are acceptable? These are not merely historical questions. They are ethical ones, and they remain unanswered. Lynnewood Hall today is a shell, a beautiful rotting carcass waiting for someone wealthy enough to restore it or patient enough to watch it collapse. The most recent photographs show a house in advanced decay. Collapsed ceilings, water, damaged walls, broken windows, vegetation growing through the floors. It looks like the set of a horror film, like a cautionary tale rendered in limestone and marble, and that is exactly what it is. A cautionary tale about ambition unmoored from purpose, about wealth pursuing permanence in a world where permanence does not exist, about the human cost of monuments that ultimately mean nothing. If you've stayed with this story to this point, if you've followed the thread from streetcar fortune to shipwreck to decades of slow collapse, you understand that this is about more than one family or one mansion. This is about the systems we build and maintain, about who benefits and who pays, about the difference between wealth and meaning. That understanding is rare, valuable, and worth preserving. The choice to support work that pursues these questions, not as entertainment, but as necessary ethical inquiry, is what allows it to continue. The final question that Lynnewood Hall poses is this: what monuments are we building that will look like cautionary tales a century from now? What fortunes are we accumulating that will disperse within 3 generations? What servants are we employing, literal or metaphorical, whose names will be forgotten while ours are preserved? These questions do not have comfortable answers, but they are worth asking. Because the alternative is to repeat the pattern, to build our own Lynnewood Halls and watch them crumble and wonder, too late, whether any of it was worth the cost. The rain still falls on the Pennsylvania countryside. Lynnewood Hall still stands, barely, waiting for a fate that remains uncertain. Eleanor Elkins Widener is long dead, buried beside the husband and son she lost to the Titanic. The paintings are in museums. The library stands at Harvard. The streetcar lines have been replaced by buses and subways and highways. The fortune has dispersed through a century of inheritance and taxation and expenditure. The servants have vanished into the same obscurity that claimed them in life. And all that remains is the house and the story and the haunting question of what we owe to each other, to the past, to the future. The Wideners built Lynnewood Hall to announce their arrival, to claim their place among America's aristocracy, to create something permanent that would outlast their lives. They failed. The house is dying, the family is scattered, the permanence was illusion, but the story survives, and the story is the only monument that matters. Not because it celebrates the Wideners, but because it reveals them their ambition and their tragedy, their wealth and their powerlessness, their dreams of immortality and their absolute mortality. This is what we inherit from the Gilded Age, not the mansions which are crumbling, but the knowledge that wealth cannot purchase meaning, cannot guarantee permanence, cannot protect us from the ice and the darkness and the cold. The ocean keeps its secrets still. Joseph and George Widener are somewhere in the North Atlantic, their bodies long since consumed by salt and time and the indifference of nature. Lynnewood Hall keeps its secrets too, slowly revealing them as the structure fails, and the archive opens and historians piece together the fragments of lives lived in that house. And we are left with the story and the obligation to learn from it, to see clearly what the Wideners could not see, that monuments crumble, that fortunes fail, that the only things that endure are the stories we tell and the choices we make about who matters and what we owe to each other. This is the tragedy of Lynnewood Hall. Not that it was built, but that it was necessary. Not that it fell, but that it was always going to fall. Not that the Wideners dreamed of permanence, but that they believed wealth could purchase it. The dream was beautiful. The house was magnificent, and all of it was built on foundations of sand, waiting for the tide to come in and wash it all away. The tide has come, the house is washing away, and we are left with the question that has no answer but demands to be asked. What are we building? What costs are we accepting, whose labor are we rendering invisible? What monuments will our descendants find, a century from now, crumbling in the countryside, and what will they understand about us from the ruins we leave behind? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. They are meant to make you see, to make you pause, to make you recognize that the patterns do not end with history but continue into the present moment, shaping choices we make every day. If this story has made you see differently, if it has shifted your understanding even slightly, then share that shift. Not as promotion, but as invitation. Because these conversations matter more than monuments, more than fortunes, more than all the marble and bronze and limestone in the world. The rain falls, the house crumbles, the story endures. And somewhere in the wreckage, between the broken plaster and the rotting wood and the shattered glass, there is a lesson about what matters and what does not, about what endures and what dissolves. About the cost of ambition and the price of forgetting. Listen carefully. The ruins have something to tell us if we have the courage to hear it.